All right, I think we're live. Let's get going. So welcome people watching. I hope you're doing fine. I hope you're ready for some Rust. So I'm basically just gonna jump right into it. So what we started working on last week was basically a web app in Rust from scratch. Well, from scratch in the sense that we built the whole thing ourselves, but we use a web framework and that sort of stuff. We don't write our own web framework. That might be a fun stream some other time though. So we're trying around to use async Rust. We're using the web framework Tide. We had a discussion last time about the different kinds of web frameworks and the ups and downs of the different ones. The database library we're using is SQLX. We're using Postgres, and we're using a bunch of other sort of miscellaneous crates that aren't too important for the time being. And so last time was just sort of trying to wrap our head around Tide, figure out what's the basic structure like, how do you make endpoints, how do you respond with JSON, what's the status code, how do you run queries and sort of get the connection pool into the Tide server, stuff like that. And then we briefly started exploring how to write tests for Tide. And specifically, the thing that we ended up doing was we were trying to figure out if we want to be able to run like multiple tests in parallel. How do we do that? How do they all share the same database? Should we use transactions? Should we just run like one test at a time, not in parallel? Stuff like that. And where we basically ended was a setup that a viewer actually suggested that I had not thought about myself. And it is that for each test, we basically create a database specifically for that test. And then we migrate the database using our migration files. And when the test is done, we use the drop trait in Rust so that when the test database struct is basically dropped, then we also nuke the database. That has the side effect of if the test doesn't succeed, the database is left around. I don't think that's a huge deal. It means potentially if we wanted to like look at the test data that was there when the test failed, we could do that. I'm not sure that that's something that we're going to want to do, but this is at least the setup for now. It does have the advantage of actually being able to run multiple tests in parallel without having them interfere with each other, which is kind of nice. So what I figure we would start with today is to sort of clean up the setup a bit. Integrate it with the rest of the sort of making test requests and stuff like that, and get that working. And then we can start to build out the user like registration, login, authentication, password stuff, those kinds of things. And once we have that set up, we should basically be ready to implement sort of Twitter-ish sort of logic. There's nothing like at before and at after. No. Not sort of built into Rust. You could potentially make it with procedural macros, but it's not built in. If it turns out to be working really well for us, we could consider extracting it into a crate so that other people can use it. And thanks for the follow, by the way. So I guess the first step is just to see that everything still works, and it does. I tested this before the stream, by the way, so we wouldn't be totally fucked. So we create a test server, which has that was this sort of test backend thing. That's basically the structure that you need to send requests to Tide. I don't know they were actually using that. You make a test DB. That's the thing that connects to the database. Creates it, runs the migrations, and then it creates a pool, and then it returns the URL to the database and the connection pool. And this is where in the drop of testDB, we also nuke this testDB. So I think we somehow need to be able to get this connection pool into the test server, which I'm not quite sure how to do. We wrote a bunch of code before to like make sort of mock requests and then execute them against the test server, which I expect we're able to just sort of reuse as is. But let's see. So the test server currently creates a database pool itself, which I don't think it has to do. It should just sort of receive one. It should be this one, right? And that's how we make sure that the server actually uses the sort of pre-provided database that we make just for that test. So let's say, what type is this? I believe it's a PG pool. Yeah, so it's a pool with a PG connection inside, and I do have the docs open, I believe. SQLX provides an alias called PG pool. That's basically just an alias for a pool with Postgres connections inside of it. So that's what we're going to be using. So this guy takes a DB pool like that, and then we need to provide it there. All right. I think that's basically all we need to sort of get that going. So that sets up, creates the server, which is here. We're using what's it called? Rust Analyzer, the LSP plugin, to like highlight the types of things and go to definition and stuff like that. It's really great. That's also what's providing the compiler error messages. So if you make, like, if we get some error, this error right here is provided by Rust Analyzer. So this function just creates the sort of tied server type, if you will, and then it calls this make server, which creates the test backend. That calls wrap on the test backend. I'm not quite sure that we need that. Why can't we just call wrap directly? Turns out that we can. And while we're at it, why do we call it wrap? Why not just call it new? We could also call it like from servers or service or something like that. So this code we basically found, we found another repo that was sort of an example of how to create a tied web app, sort of a complete web app. There's a project called the Real World App, which is like if you're looking to evaluate a web framework or something, the Real World App is basically sort of a Facebook-ish kind of thing, I believe, that you can then build to evaluate the framework. It's just sort of a way to build a bigger project without having to come up with all the functionality yourself and making the things comparable between implementations. Anyways, so does the sort of test setup that we have make sense to people? Otherwise, we're basically just going to continue sort of flushing it out and making sure that everything still works. And if there's any questions at any point, just put them in chat. I'll do my best to answer them. So this is the request type that we have. The request type is just the built-in request in the testing HTTP testing sort of library that we're using, and we added our own build method to it by implementing an extension trait to create a GET request to /users, and then to actually send that request to the server, and that returns a response. We can get the status. I believe we added our own method to decode the body into JSON, and then we can actually assert on what that is. So this will like set up the server, and then it'll call /users to get all the users basically, and assert that there are no users in the database to begin with, which makes sense. There shouldn't be. So let's just see if the test passes. And it does not, because the database environment URL is not present. And the error comes from test helpers 133. That is this guy. Why is that not there? that is because it gets set up by this guy, .env. So who calls that? It's db_url. Yeah, so let's just move this one down here. .env will basically read the .env file that we have, and for each line it'll create an environment variable with this name and this value. So it was complaining about this particular environment variable not being set, which makes sense. I believe it should work now, or at least get a different error. There we go. So we should also be able to, so this is basically this code that we did before is just sort of a wraparound doing this sort of stuff. We didn't quite figure out how to make post requests yet. So currently we're just doing the sort of the raw way to create a request. We will be wrapping it though. Currently we're just kind of making sure that everything still works. And it does. So we should also be able to get the user back. This basically asserts that at the beginning there's no users. Then if we create a user, then there should be one user that matches the one that we created, basically. All right. I have been thinking though, I would like to shorten this a bit. Having to say request build get URL is kind of unnecessary. You could just basically have this, right? Mute server, like that. That would basically be the same. So I think we should just sort of adapt this to work in this style. So to do that, we need a function called get. We also have like a bunch of stuff for setting up the database. I would like to possibly move that out into a separate module. So we need a pop fn get. Takes a URL, that's for now it's just a string. And then it returns a thing that we can say .send on, which I believe is basically the request builder for now. Let's call it test request. If I could type, that would be nice. Test request URL. Let's do like that. I have to make this public. We want to be able to call send. I think that should basically be this function, like that. Self URL unwrap. That's because previously it was technically possible to create a request builder that didn't have a URL, so if we didn't call URL, that would be optional, or that would be none rather. This design basically gets around that, which is kind of nice. So we don't need to call unwrap anymore. There we go. I think this works. Yep. So now we can basically nuke all this stuff, right? Like that. Should still pass. There we go. The post request. Let's clean up the database library stuff first. Just get all this sort of creation of the temporary databases out of the test helpers file. It's also a bit annoying that we have to do like these 3 lines at the beginning of every file. What if we just move these in here? Like that. that still work? I think so. No. Why not? That's weird. All this does is pass db pool. Is it because I think I know what's wrong. So if we down here we print dropping the test db, and up here why does that not work? You need to have HTTP backend bound there, HTTP service rather. There we go. And then, so what I'm thinking is that that the database was dropped prematurely, and that's why the request failed. So by basically implementing drop for each of our types, we're able to see in which order they actually get called. If the test would actually pass, in order to do that, we need to do the little copy paste thing that we did before. Put that guy in there, like that. Yeah, so you can see we're dropping the test database, and then we're dropping that test backend afterwards. What we want is we basically want it to be the other way around, right? Like we can't, let's see, if we print, so if you look at the code here, we make the test server, then we say print made test server, and then we run the test. And if you look at the output, you can see that we're basically dropping the test database before we're actually making the test server. And then we run the test. So at that point, the database is gone, right? And then the test backend goes away. So what I think is happening is that, so this guy, the test DB, holds on to, is what causes the test database to be dropped. So what I'm thinking is that this method, what does that do? That just clones the connection pool. So that means that the value that comes out here is an owned value. It's not tied to the lifetime of testDB at all. So we just pass that like clone into the server. At this point, we're done using testDB, which means that it'll be dropped here, basically, which is what we're seeing with the prints. So what I'm thinking that we need to do is we can just pass the test database in here. That way the two lifetimes are sort of tied together. Let's do that. Needs to be passed in here, like that. I think testDB doesn't implement debug. Let's just derive it. There we go. I think it should pass now, right? There we go. Nice. Does that make sense? Why that would fail and what the sort of fix was? I guess you need to be careful when you're implementing drop for things that are like dependent. Let's just remove the prints that we had. Does it make sense to be passing the test database in there? Test backend. What have we called it? Test server. I think this is already much nicer. I'm debating if this function should just be called setup or something like that. Like test setup maybe. Yeah, let's do that. I'm still using Rust Analyzer to rename the variables and the functions. It's really handy. I think we're basically good now, right? I do want to move this this setup of the test database into its own module though. What if we say mod testdb? Where do you want it to be? Tests. Source test helpers / testdbrs, like that. Yeah. So since this file is currently inside the test helpers module, so when we create a new module in there, it needs to be nested inside that folder. We can just copy all this stuff in there. That one doesn't need to be public. Run migrations. It's basically just the stuff on the testdb itself that needs to be public, right? Needs Postgres connection. Env. We could technically copy the imports from the other place. That is because connect this one. And we need to import testdb here. There we go. Hey, Lion, welcome. Thanks for the raid. How's it going? All right, so this is already much nicer. I guess it makes sense to quickly commit here. Clean up testing setup. So that's the GET request. Let's see if we can do the same, make post request a little nicer. let's say that we have a similar post URL. I suppose it needs to take the post body. So we could have the post body just be a value, which is basically a JSON value. Or we could use some generics and have it be anything that is serializable, basically, which I think is a bit nicer. That means that if we wanted to use, like if we had our own structs for defining the request bodies, we could basically pass those in, which would be convenient. We just need to use Saturday, serialize. And then we need to return a test request that needs to have the URL and the body. You could make, like, you could do this, right? You could say but in this case, like with this setup, it's technically possible to have a GET request. I suppose we also need to store the method here. With this setup, it's technically possible to have a GET request with a request body. But as far as I know, that's not valid. HTTP, I don't believe so. We could also say, we also convert test request into an enum and say we have a GET request with a URL inside it. And then we have a post that also has a URL and a body, like that, which I think is nicer, actually. Let's do that. This is a test request post, URL, body is Saturday JSON to value, I believe. This needs to be a T. This was a result. We can just unwrap it. Normally unwrapping is not something you want to do, but in our case, since we're in test code, I think it's fine. Now the send method on test request needs to change. We can say match self test request get URL. Or if it's a post, and then we need to do all this stuff, right? Let's see, how do you make the URL? Like that. No field URL, that makes sense. It's just this URL here that we pulled out in the pattern match. And the body is no longer the hard-coded thing. That is body like that. That's curious. We call toString on it. I was thinking like, why are we able to do this? So the type of the JSON macro is a value, right? A capital V value, whereas the body is as well a value. So I was like, why can we do this but not this? But it turns out we call that toString on it, like that. Set the JSON application content type to JSON, and then we simulate the request. Could technically do this. factor that out. Like this. That means we should now be able to do, let's see, let response post / users with the request from before, like that. Send mute server. That gives us a response. The status should be 200. That should all be the same, right? So I expect this to pass now if we did it right. Sweet, and it does. All this is very similar. Let's just get with the URL like that. All right, very nice. What's this to do here? Map invalid data error to some 400 response. Just move that to the top. We'll get back to it later. All right. That's pretty nice. Let's commit that. Requests. Can you make a post request without a body? I guess you can, right? Or can you? Yeah, I mean, you totally can. It's totally valid. Currently, it's not supported. You could consider this, making this an option if we wanted to support optional post bodies. Let's cross that bridge when we get there. It's fine for now. So, all right. Let's just try creating another test to verify that our sort of database separation stuff actually works. I don't see why it wouldn't. It totally does. Great. Cool. I think we're actually ready to get started implementing the user authentication authorization stuff. Yo, Faith Raven, thanks for the sub. It's crazy. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. So notice that usually the way I start building these sorts of libraries and tools and stuff, I usually just start with putting everything in one file. You can see that that's basically the way that we started with the test helpers file, right? And then as we sort of massage the code and kind of play around with it and figure out what exactly it is that we want, then we can slowly start pulling it out into separate modules and start making like proper abstractions around it. But in the beginning, it's very sort of just cowboy code and figure out what is it exactly that you actually want. Which, like, our main RS file is very much still the same way. We're not going to end up with just like a huge single file app or something like that. We are actually going to think about what are the boundaries between like the domain layer, the database layer, testing, those kinds of things. For now, we're not quite there. So we're kind of developing it organically as we go. All right, let's see. So this test doesn't really make any sense anymore, right? This is not how you're actually able to create a user. I'm thinking that we have some endpoint to like create a user that takes a username and a password. It returns an error if the username is already taken. Otherwise, it takes the password, then it encrypts it, saves it in the database, and it returns an auth token that you can use to make requests as that user. So we need like a users table and auth table, auth tokens, authentication tokens kind of table. And then to actually log in on subsequent visits to the site, there's an endpoint you can call to not create a user, but to log in, where you just provide the username and password. We verify that the password matches the encrypted password in the database. If so, you get back that same token. We could mess around with like making the tokens expire and having refresh tokens and that kind of stuff. I don't think that's particularly interesting, so we're not gonna mess around with that. So I think that setup will basically work. I'm not huge into web security, but I have found a small gem that's, not a gem rather, whoa, that was from my Ruby days, crate, that seems to be pretty sort of easy to get going with regards to actually encrypting the passwords and verifying them later on, because we definitely don't want to be storing the passwords in clear text, right? So this was the library that I found. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. Argonautica RS would be my bet. You create a hasher, you give it a password, you give it some secret key that it tells you to store in your .env file, which is exactly what we're going to do. And then you call hash, that gives you back a hash, basically, which is just a string. That's what we save in the database on the user table. And then later you can provide that same hash, give it the clear text password that you want to verify with, the same secret key from your environment file, verify, that gives you a bool, and that's how we know that the users are basically identical. So we're not saving the user's actual passwords. That's not something that you want to do. So let's add this to our project. And one nice thing that I did notice was that they actually had an async API, which was kind of cool. First of all, the docs are great. Like, there's tons of detail here about what each thing does. And at the same time, they're sort of providing, like, this is sort of the safe, easy way to use this library. And the default, it does say that it does have good defaults. So I don't think we're going to have to get into a whole lot of customization stuff. But again, web security is not my strong suit. So I did notice that they had, so they have the hash method that blocks, and then they have a non-blocking version that returns a future, which is cool because, well, Tide is async, so we can deal with futures. It does, however, return a futures 0.1. The most recent version is 0.3. So we have to sort of use the compatibility stuff that's built into future to convert the 0.1 future into a 0.3 future. But that's easy enough to do. So this is what I imagine that we'll be using. I do have a process running here that will compile the docs for all the libraries that are included in our crate. And then we're sort of able to like search for all the docs throughout all the crates that we depend on from one place, which is nice. So let's write the migration file. For now, we just have one like setup.sql file that we're using. Over time, we can consider expanding that into multiple files with like migrations with timestamps and those sort of things. It's really only necessary when we want to do the first deploy. Until then, having just one file with all the SQL stuff inside it is cool. So we definitely need a user table with a username that needs to be unique. My raw SQL syntax for creating indexes is a bit rusty. Create index, users, username, on. I'm not sure. Users, username, unique. Is that how you do it? Did we have a setup file? We did. So this setup script will drop the databases if they exist, and then basically recreate them based on this this SQL file. We don't actually need to create the dedicated test database anymore because we're creating one database per test. So this becomes a bit simpler. Let's try to run it to see that it works. It did not. How do you make a unique index in Postgres? Create unique index. There we go. That means that the database will verify that we don't have two users with the same username. I don't think we want anything else on the user for now. We should have like created at, which is a timestamp with zone, time zone, not null. Updated that. I'm not sure if this is what the value is called. Let's find out. Seems to work. Does it work in one word? Is timestamp in one word? No, it's not. I've seen in Diesel, another Rust ORM, they call it timestamp TZ. So if we say timestamp TZ, does that work as well? Seems to work. Let's just do that. So this is so that we can track when a user was created and when the user was last updated. For now, we're going to have to manage those two timestamps automatically. We could look into like making triggers and stuff like that to have them created automatically, but for now, let's just do it this way. That's fine. Is there anything else that we want on the user? Oh yeah, the password. Hashed password. Varchar not null. I usually keep all my SQL lowercase. SQL is case insensitive, so it doesn't matter why, like if you write things uppercase or lowercase. Anything else that we need? I think we're good for now. Do need the tokens. Let's call it auth tokens. Needs an ID, a user ID, UUID, not null, and it needs the token, which is a varchar, not null. And then I want to make sure that I want to have a foreign key constraint on the user ID to verify that for all user tokens, we do have a corresponding user, so that when we delete a user, we have to make sure to also delete the auth tokens. I'm not sure what the syntax is to do that. Postgres, foreign key index, sounds about right. How to make one? Constraint. Not null constraints unique. Primary key. References. Sounds like what we want. References, users, ID. If there's any SQL wizards in the chat, feel free to let me know if I'm doing stuff correctly or not. I've used I have a lot of experience with Ruby on Rails, a web framework for the Ruby programming language, and there they have a sort of Ruby DSL for building these migrations file. So I'm not used to creating tables and that sort of stuff in regular SQL. I'm very familiar with like selects and those kinds of statements, but I haven't done create table that much, which is funny. That did work, right? We did test it. Yep. Let's just see that actually creating the test server still works. And it did not. Ah, yeah, right. I thought this might happen. So if we look at testDB, let's look at where the error actually happened. So it's on line 113. Here we print out the rows. I guess that's not strictly necessary. Is that the right line? Yeah, so it's on this error. Wait. (118). Yeah. So the way this works is we read the bin setup SQL file, and then we pass that whole thing, that whole string to our database and just say like run this string, which apparently you can't do because SQLX will try to create like prepare statements and stuff like that for it. I'm not sure if there's a way to turn that off, but it doesn't really make sense for like create table statements to prepare those because we're never really going to run them again. I'm not sure if there's a way to turn those off. There is the query function, SQLX query. Query file. Interesting. Can we use that to just run the file directly? Does it support multiple files? Query stored in a separate file. Useful for last query just to clean up the multi-line strings. No, I don't think so. It mentioned that it has the same syntax as their query macro, which I don't think supports multiple queries in one. We could of course just split it by like semicolons and just do that. What does query return? It returns a query object, bind, execute. I was wondering if there was like a don't prepare or something method, but that doesn't seem like it. Let's just try to split it on semicolons. For query in SQL split. That worked. Let's just try to run the rest of the code and see if we get some sort of error when we try to actually create the user, saying that like the hash password and the timestamps are missing, just to verify that things are actually working. We get an internal error. That's not a great test error. Test 18. Yeah, that's just from here. I wonder if there's a way to print the failure message. What is this query doing? It just selects all the tables. We did remove some code there before, right? But that was just printed out all the tables that we had. I think that's just debugging code from some earlier issues that we had. I think we can just remove it. Yeah, so this error is not great. And you can imagine that we're going to run into that at some other point where like we accidentally panic or return an error from the actual handler of the request. So we should probably find a way to fix that. Do we have to use a middleware? I think so, because here we're just kind of using question mark to unwrap, or rather bubble up the error if it's there. We don't want to attach like a log if error method for each of these, right? That would be kind of tedious to do. I think a a middleware is what we're going to have to go for. So Tide, the web framework that we're using, has this concept of middlewares. If you're not familiar with web frameworks, this is quite a common thing. It's basically a way for you to sort of intercept requests and almost like decorate the response, if you will. So this is an example of a logging middleware that takes a request and then it takes whatever next middleware is going to run. So middleware is sort of nested inside out, like Russian nesting dolls almost. So you can like do stuff before the request runs. You can call the next middleware that gives you back the response, and then you have to return the response maybe at the end. So the idea is that if you wanted to intercept all post requests and make them into a patch request or whatever, I'm not sure why you would do that, but that would basically be a way for you to do that. You could also just like ignore all GET requests if you wanted to. So the idea is that the middleware is sort of nested and you keep calling next each time, and eventually the next middleware will be the actual application that generates the final response. So I think that's what we're going to have to go for. I think we can make some sort of middleware that grabs out all the errors and actually prints them out. So how do you attach a middleware? Examples, middleware. This can be used in the application using the server middleware method. Route middleware, server middleware. Yeah, all right. So up here we create the server. Let's just rename this server rather than app. And then we say .middleware that takes something that implements middleware and debug and returns self, so we can sort of keep chaining. I watched your stream some time ago, and your workflow convinced me to switch to Linux and start learning Vim and Rust. Is there maybe a way you can make some YouTube videos on those topics? For example, Rust beginners. By the way, love the stream. Thanks. Just so we're clear, I don't use Linux. I use Mac OS. You basically have the terminal, which is sort of a Unix, Linux-ish kind of thing. But yeah, if you want to learn Rust, I highly recommend just Google Rust book. This is sort of the official online free book basically for learning Rust. It's quite extensive and it's really good. Like I've not heard from anybody who said that they did not enjoy reading this. If you're like, if you already know how to program, you can sort of skim through the first couple of chapters, just figuring out the syntax. But it does a really good job of explaining like concurrency, ownership, type system, traits, those kind of things that are sort of unique to Rust. But yeah, the book is definitely what I recommend starting out with. I'll just put a link to it in chat. Otherwise, I believe there are like tons of sort of getting started with Rust videos on YouTube. But I definitely think that the book is a great introduction to get started. And from that point on, you can just sort of start building small like toy projects. Is this the web app? Yeah, we're making it right now. This is the code so far. All right, where were we? Oh yes, we wanted to make a middleware that would grab all errors and try to print a nice error message for us in tests. So how do you make a middleware? Trait middleware takes the state, handle, takes the request and the next. All right. Use middleware. They did have a log middleware. What does that do? Log middleware new. Log all incoming requests and responses. The middleware is enabled by default in Tokyo. In Tide. Are you sure? Ah, it uses the logging crate. All right. So I guess that's what we have to enable in tests. Did we set up a logger? Pretty log. Where do we set up .env in the test helpers? Do that there. So now we see a bunch of logs. That's better. We don't see the exact error message though. There it is. Null value in column hash passwords violates non-null constraint. I played around with Linux for like half a year-ish in university. I bought like a cheap ThinkPad Lenovo laptop at the time and put Arch on it. That was fun. It was a bit too much like configuration necessary to get it working for me. But I don't mind Linux. What I'm thinking though is I believe you can only call this once, like set up the actual logger once, and it'll panic if you've set it up twice. Yeah, set logger error. So what I'm curious is if we have two tests and each sets up a test database and creates and sets up the logger, will that not work for us? So we only call the logger once when we create the test database. Yeah, that doesn't work. So we need a way to set up the logger, and basically if it's already been set up, don't do anything. So how do we do that? What's the logger that we're using? Pretty env logger. Init. Try init. Sorry for the noise in the background. My girlfriend is cleaning the kitchen, I think. So this is what we want, right? It returns a result. And we can just say .ok to ignore the result, basically. So this should work. Yep. And running two tests. All the sort of log messages are kind of mixed together, right? Yeah, we see both requests there. Is that because, I suppose that's because we're running both tests in parallel. Yeah. All right, I guess we can live with that for now. I wonder if there's a way to get that sort of separated out. I'm not sure. Anyways, now we do actually get the specific error message. Let's remove this second test. Are you streaming your whole desktop or just a window? Just a window. I have OBS hidden down here in the corner. I have in the past had a setup where I had like two screens, and then I had like chat and notes and other stuff on one screen, and then I just streamed the entire screen. But the setup I have now, I have an ultra wide 34-inch, I think, something like that. And while the inner geek in me would like to have two of those, it's not really feasible. And I do stream from the same, I do like code and stream on the same computer. That's why I don't know if you can hear it. Hopefully not, but the fans are spinning. I put it underneath my table to sort of get it as far away as possible, so hopefully you can't hear the fans. I'm not sure if, like, when the app is big enough, if the computer's going to be able to handle both streaming and coding. So far it's been fine. You can see my CPU load up here in the corner. Seems to work. Still into cardistry. Hope to meet you this year's CardistryCon. Yes, yeah, I still do cardistry on a regular basis. For those who don't know, cardistry is like a card shuffling kind of things, like juggling with cards, basically, something I've been doing for a lot of years. Like when I work day by day, I basically shuffle cards all the time. I sort of can't work without shuffling cards. But I think it's a bit distracting to be hearing cards constantly on the stream. Maybe not. Do you have to size the terminal some specific size in order to preserve the ratio for stream? Yes. I use an app for Mac called Moon, which allows you to basically set up your windows however you want, and then sort of record that as being a layout that you can then like put all your windows back into that exact layout. So yeah, that's what I do. It was very tedious to get set up, and I'm not sure I got the sizing quite right yet, but yeah. I know you can stream, like in OBS, that's the streaming program I use. You can sort of pick to stream only one window, but then you have to, in OBS, you have to switch scenes back and forth between the two windows. So I just basically have, I have a Safari window on top of OBS, basically. That sort of matches in size. That's what I do. So where were we? Oh yeah, we're now able to see the error message is there. And it is the error that we basically expected. So I say that there should not be any users at first. And when we create a user, you have to supply both a username and a password. What should the password be? Foobar. Responds with 200. It should respond with a like OAuth request token. Let's say we can decode the response like this. Decode it into a we can just decode into a value, I guess, and then get the token, and then get the data out of a value. Value as array. What I imagine that we're going to respond with is something like this. Data token, and then that's the token that goes there. Could technically have a struct that represents this. Data token response. So what I'm thinking is we could have a struct that represents this setup, right? That means it needs to have a data key, which has some value, and then we derive deserialize here. And then this guy basically needs to have a token. Which is a string. Token response. It's a bit tedious to have to make these for each response. You can imagine that everything, all of our responses are going to be nested inside data. It's a bit tedious to have to make each of these just to make a separate one that has the specific data. So what I think we're going to try to do is say data response of t has a data that's a t. use Saturday deserialize, and then I can say that I want this guy to be deserialized into a data response token. Response. It's annoying that I have to type response twice. Like that. And then basically this derived deserialize will basically deserialize. So that means that you can deserialize a data response where the sort of T that's inside the data key is itself deserialized. So I believe if we remove the bound here, then it should fail to compile because T doesn't implement deserialize, which is sort of what the compiler is trying to tell us here. So if we do, let's say this is the response. Let's just print that out so we can see what it looks like. Oh yeah, and we obviously don't get a response because we haven't actually implemented updated the code that actually creates the user. Makes sense. We have this guy that logs the database URL every time. I don't think we need that. Test db65. 65. This guy. Yep. So let's, before we actually implement the code for real, let's sort of write in sort of a TDD style, let's write the code that we wish we had. So we wish that the response that we got back, let's get the token. Token is the response.data.token. And then we need to say, let's have an endpoint where we can, like a /me or something, to get data about the current user. And we need to attach like a header or here something here with that actually has the token inside it. For now, let's just say it responds with a let's call this one data token responds with a me. Me will have a username, which should be Bob, because that's the username we passed in up there. Yeah, right. So we're using another library called Assert Json Diff, which is used in testing when you want to compare like large JSON values. If you just compare them directly, and imagine you have like objects with like 50 or 60 fields, and they differ on like one tiny value that's like nested deeply inside this object. If you just get the two objects and you're like, hey dude, these are not the same, it's just a compiler yelling at you. It's not very easy to actually figure out why they're different. So this is a library that'll basically take the two JSON types and actually do a diff and figure out exactly where they are different. But of course it only works on JSON values. It doesn't work on our sort of arbitrary deserializable type. So let's just say we get a value. That's fine. And we just say that the data that we get back should have, it should not be an array. It should be a, let's see, it should be data. Oops. With a username Bob. The token is currently not used because we need to figure out how to actually set headers on these requests. That was in test helpers. Imagine that we're going to have some, where do we go here, like header authentication. something like this. Right. How do we add that? So we need to figure out how do we add headers to this request. So that lives in HTTP types. You can see the name of the crate down here in the file name. We could also be like, where does it actually come from? It comes from HTTP types. Whoa. Request. How do we add headers to this guy? Header names, header mute, header values, insert header. Try into header name, to header values. Set an HTTP header. And that returns an option vec of header value. Is that like the current headers after you've set the one? So headers insert. Or is it, if the header with that name was already inserted, then what was it? Why is it a vec though? To header values. Can you set a header to multiple values? That doesn't make sense. Headers can only have one value, right? Insert header. I mean, it is code that looks like this that we want to do, right? Just with strings. Append header. What's the difference between insert and append? Unlike insert, this function will not override the contents of a header, but insert a header if there aren't any, or else append to the existing list of headers. What? Unlike insert, this function will not override the contents of a header. Does this like assume that the header is already there? I guess we want to use append header. Whoops. Close the wrong file. So what we eventually want to do is on the request. Oops. We want to do something like this, right? We just need to store the headers off. For now, let's just do that in a hash map with strings. I'm just thinking it's a bit annoying that our test request, it's now going to have like headers, hash map string. That one goes there as well. You can imagine that eventually we're going to have a patch, delete, and they're all going to have a whole bunch of fields in common, right? Which is sort of annoying. It would almost be nicer to have a struct that is the test request, and that has like the URL, the headers, the kinds of things that all requests have. And then we have a field in that struct that is itself an enum that has the specifics for each. Although that will only be the post body, right? No, I still think that makes sense, because then we have sort of a clear, like, we're able to sort of verify it by the type system that we don't have a get request with a post body accidentally. It's not a huge deal in the test code, obviously, but I feel that it's a nice habit to get into, to be like, with the sort of data structures that I have now, are you able to represent states in the type system that aren't actually valid states? So if you imagine if we had the body value here, having a get request with a body is not actually valid. So let's say this is a, let's make this a struct. Test request. No. It has a URL. Then let's call it a kind test request kind. That'll be this guy. Get is just empty. Post has the body like that. So this now becomes test request. Like that. And this guy comes like that. Kind test request get no data. So this one doesn't need to match anymore. Oh yes, it does. It does need to match on the kind. URL is now get our names right, and URL is now self.url. This needs to be public. All right, so now we should be able to say headers. And we need to import it. Hash map. And we need to set it up here. New. All right, and then we basically want a method to actually set a header. That's on test request. Pub fn header takes a mutable self, takes a key string value string, returns self, because we want to be able to chain multiple calls, right, and eventually call send at the end. We should be able to do self.headers insert. I can type key value, and there we go. That works. It's a bit annoying that we have to borrow this string every time, right? We can make the API, the reason that we have to do that is because this takes a string slice and not a string. It might sometimes be a slice, right? If we wanted to do like content type application JSON like that, then it would be a slice. So we can make the API a bit more general by saying we take a value that is just an impl to string. And that basically worked because we're already calling to string. That was nice. You could also have like into string and then call into. That would work as well. So I think our test is correct now, right? Create the user, get the token, get me with that token, pass it out, and then we get the correct user back. And we get the same error as before, that the hashed password column is missing, which does make sense. We're not actually setting the headers here. Let's do that. For key value in self headers. I think. It did work on the string slice. No. That works. Is that because we have to borrow? Wait, what type is key? Key is a string. Like that? Yeah. I guess yeah, so append header takes something that implements into header name. Let's just look at that and see if we can understand why that error was happening. That kind of sucks. It just shows try into. We can't actually, can we see what implements into header name? It's a bit unfortunate that we can't really see that, right? And this page, so this is from the standard library basically, it only shows implementations that are local to the standard library itself. Implementing try into. And here you can see it does work on a slice. So the type of this guy, right, is like this. And so if we say, if you ask the compiler like what type does key actually have, by just pretending it has type unit, which it obviously doesn't, you can see it's a string. So I guess when we borrow it, you can either get a slice or you can get a borrowed string like that. And I'm guessing the compiler can't figure out like which one we want for some reason, because like this didn't work, right? So here it's a reference to a string and not an actual string slice. So one way that you could sort of force it to actually make a slice for you is just to say Assert, and that seems to work. Methods like Assert and asref are super useful when you encounter errors like this. That works. We're actually inserting the headers now into the request, and we should be able to actually implement this guy for real, right? Where we actually create the user. So we insert into users username, password. If I could find the keys. So that is so the create user type that we deserialize into has username, password, it's a string, and this is create user password. Column password on users doesn't exist. That's because it was hashed password. So this is super cool. This is a feature of SQLX, the query database library that we're using. It actually runs this query at compile time. Well, it doesn't run it, but it checks the query at compile time against the real database that I have running locally to ensure that it is actually valid. And it gets type information from the database about like what type the query actually returns, and gives you compile errors for basically raw SQL queries inline when they're wrong, which is really great. So this needs to be hashed password. Did we have anything else on the user? Yes, timestamps. Created that, updated that. That needs to be, did we include chrono? So chrono is a datetime library for Rust. Use chrono prelude star. the way you get the current time in Chrono is you say UTC now, I believe. Yep. Let's just pull this out into variable. Like that. So this is obviously wrong, right? We're not actually hashing the password. This is just to make sure that we can actually move on with the test. It failed. EOF while parsing value. What's it say? On line 28. Yeah, that's when we parse the response, because we don't actually send anything back, I think. It does body string. Let's print that out just so we can see what it looks like. I'm curious because we don't send anything back here. So I'm curious if the response is just an empty string. Yeah, it is. Wait, what? Empty array. Ah, yeah, that makes sense because this is JSON and this is just nothing. Right, so that's the first one is from this guy up here. I suppose it does make sense to actually just log the request. So a neat thing in Rust is that if you print stuff during a test, it only gets shown if the test actually fails. So that means that we can have sort of debug code in our tests such that when a test fails, we don't have to add all those debug prints back in. They just kind of show up automatically, which is nice. So let's keep that debug in there. This way we can easily see what the response actually was. We can see that it was indeed empty. So this should get back a user. Can we say returning ID? Now there's no method execute. Is that because you have to say fetch one? Yep. Row. We should be able to say row.id. What type does that have? It's a UUID. All right. So SQLX is one of the downsides of using macros to basically generate these queries is that it's a bit tough to actually see what the return type of this guy is. So query will return different things depending on what type of query you're actually doing. So previously we were just doing an insert query that doesn't return anything. In this case, the method you have to call is execute, which just runs the query and gives you, I believe it just gives you a tuple back, an empty tuple. Oh, it gives you a U64, which I guess is, I honestly don't know what that is. Maybe it's the number of rows inserted, or the number of rows affected by the insert statement. I believe, I'm not sure. But if you want to actually run a select statement, you actually care about the result. You don't just care about running an arbitrary select statement. So I believe this is Postgres specific, but you can say returning ID, and then it'll return you the ID that you passed to the insert statement. We technically could save that in a variable, but all right, let's just do it like this. This way, if we wanted like Postgres to generate the UUID for us, which we could technically do, that would work, because otherwise we would have no way of getting at like the most recent ID that we just created. But now, since this insert statement is sort of a select statement in a way, you can imagine it as like insert the user and then select the most recent one and give us back the ID. Now execute can't be called anymore, just sort of magically. And if we look at the docs, it's not quite clear why that is, right? SQL query, the green one down here. I don't know if they actually have an example that calls execute. No. But they have their the GitHub docs, the README that they have is quite good at explaining this stuff. There's also like fetch one to fetch exactly one response. There's fetch optional. There's fetch all, I believe. Yeah, so this is execute, and there's a bunch of other returns the number of rows affected. Yeah, that makes sense. So this needs to be fetch one because we should only get one row back. It has an ID. I guess, can you return multiple things? Can you do that? Yeah, because we don't actually need the ID, right? You could return it, that would probably be nice. So let's say like this. And then the JSON that we return is data username ID, which I think should work. No, because we want to respond with the token, not the user. Makes sense? So we don't actually care about, we do want the ID. Let's just leave this as a to-do. All right, let's do that. So this is the ID, row ID. And then we need to insert an auth token as well for the user. Insert into, what do we call the table? Auth tokens. Do you need to be smart to be an engineer? No. There are plenty of stupid engineers out there. It does help. Are you thinking of becoming an engineer, but you're intimidated because you don't think you're smart? Auth token. So what professions do smart people do instead? Funny. I mean, it doesn't hurt if you're smart, so you're welcome to do engineering stuff. User ID, token. We want timestamps here as well, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Wait. ID, so UUID, user ID, row.id, token. I haven't actually made that yet. Yeah, I think being lazy is actually an important skill to have as an engineer. Makes you want to automate stuff, which is kind of what the whole thing is about, to a certain extent. Created that, updated that. We don't have the token variable is not defined. Do we have? We don't have a unique constraint on this one. We should probably add that. I'm thinking if we can enforce that with a test. We could. Let's just create it by hand for now. Usually when I notice like bugs or missing constraints in this way, I usually like to make a test that proves that the bug is actually there, and then we can fix the test by fixing the bug, and then we can commit the test, and then we're basically guaranteed that we're never going to make that, like the bug is never going to come back, because then the test would fail. But for now, since we're sort of early in the development process, and like you can't, when creating a user from a test, you can't set what you want the token to be, so we wouldn't have an easy way to actually exercise that bug. So let's just say auth tokens token on auth tokens token. Are you specifically playing around with the async wait features now that they're unstable? I'm a fan of Rocket otherwise. Not specifically. I do think that most of the sort of web space is moving towards async. I don't see why not. I have actually used Rocket in the past. It's a web framework that I'm most familiar with. But because they don't have, like they aren't async at the moment, they're currently working on it. I figured it would make sense to use an async library, because if you were like a beginner starting out in Rust and you wanted to do a web app, it's likely that you're going to look for something async, just because that's kind of where the community is going. But as soon as Rocket, I believe they're also close to making it work on stable, which is super exciting. So once they have that landed and async, then I'm definitely gonna revisit Rocket, because I think it's a very great framework. I think the macro setup that they have is very ergonomic, and I like it a lot. Yeah, async is the new hotness, totally. And besides, I've been using Diesel in the past as the ORM, which is not async either, unfortunately, and it's hard to add. There's a bunch of issues on Diesel's repo to add async. And SQLX is basically an async query database runner sort of thing. So I wanted to try that as well. So far it's going great. So the token is not unique. Did we run the setup SQL file? Sometimes I just like lose my train of thought, then I'm just like rerun the test and it'll tell me how far I got. Missing field data. Why? The body is empty. Ah, that's because the body is actually empty, right? Gotcha. Token row. Let's call this raw token, because then I can name this guy token. Token.token. The user ID is not actually used. Ah, that's because we use row.id. Let's just say user ID is a bit more clear. Yep. So the token does actually come out, and it hits the /me endpoint, which we haven't actually made. Makes sense. I do wonder though, how would we generate this token randomly? We also need to actually hash the password. Does anyone in chat know a nice way to like generate just a random like string in Rust? Just like, it doesn't really matter what's in there, just like a 32 character long string. I'm not sure how to do that. There's the rand crate. Can that create like arbitrary strings of stuff? I know it can make bytes, which you can turn into characters, maybe, which you can then turn into a string. Make a bunch of random numbers. RNG. Create random passwords with alphanumeric characters. Well, yeah, we actually do something similar in the for setting up the test database. Right here, we create, so we take the original name of the database and then we add some suffix to it, and that's just generated randomly, which seems to be exactly what they're doing here. Yep, the person probably copied it from here. Sweet, thanks. Let's put that in there for now. How long should it be? I don't know, 32. Suffix, raw token, alphanumeric, import that. The Vim plugin that I'm using for Rust Analyzer does have a way to automatically import stuff, but it's broken. I get some error message in Vim, I'm not quite sure why. RNG, what is that? It's the thread random. Can you use that in an async context? Is that safe? Like, is this call going to block? I suppose not. What if there's multiple threads accessing the thread random at the same time? Future cannot be shared safely between threads. Yeah, that's what I figure. So what we probably have to do is put this guy in an arc and store it in the state, like we're doing with the request pool or the connection pool to the database. Probably. So I think, what does this return? Returns thread random, thread RNG, which is not send and not sync. That means that if we have that function, if we basically have the variable alive in a function that does an await, we basically, like, we don't know when this await is going to return. So basically all variables captured in this scope needs to be, well, if they're not send and sync, then the corresponding future that gets generated won't be send and sync. And I believe if we look at the server post, maybe it's on route, request tied post, I think, yeah, the future that you returned from a route needs to be send, which is not, because we access the thread random, which is not send. So we need to make it send. Which I think we can do by sticking it in the context, or in the state rather. So what if we say thread RNG is it clone? It is clone. It's not send and it's not sync. That means that if we stick it inside the state, then our state is not send and sync either. Does that mean we have to wrap it in a mutex? That's unfortunate. Does that even make it send? I don't think so. How do we do that? Can we make a new random every time without using the thread local random thing? Random generates a boolean. Using a thread. Can we call this one directly? No, because then we couldn't customize the iterations. Let's just see if putting it into a arc mutex, that helps. Sync arc mutex. Where's mutex in async std? Async std sync mutex. Mutext. Mutex. Yeah. So it's saying that the state cannot be shared between threads, which does make sense, unfortunately. So we could say let RNG is, well, what's the function? Thread RNG. Thread RNG. RNG arc new mutex new RNG. Yeah, so now it's complaining about, so it says that the at method is not defined. Look at that one. And at is defined on, so you can see the at method is defined on server state, server that's generic. Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. So it's implemented on state for some server type where, or for some state rather, where the state is send, sync, and static. So static means it doesn't have any references inside it. Sync means you can access it, you can mutate it concurrently, basically. And send means that you can send it across threads, which our state is not. So that means that the at method is not implemented for this particular server. And that's why the method is not there. And the problem is that if you have a value that is not send, it doesn't, or rather that is not, that is not send, it doesn't automatically become send by putting it in an arc. I guess we need a way to create our own random generator and not using the thread local, I think. Random number generators. How to see the thread local generator. Standard. Whoa. That link is broken. Sweet. There's not an example here, right? No. Distributions, no. RNGs. Oh, we're using an old version of Rand. No. Why does our docs look different? So interface with the operating system's random number source. I mean, it really doesn't matter, right? We just want to make a random string. And OS RNG is send and sync. So I think we can use that. Example usage. Freely constructed with OS RNG. Implementation is writing back at random. Create. Blocking and error handling. Put OS random. Will block until systems RNG is initialized. Seems fine, right? Let's try to use this and see. So remove that guy. So we're back to compiling. Let's just try to paste this in and see if we can do this to it. OS RNG. Totally seems to work. I guess that's what we just want to do. It wrote something about blocking. It's possible that when used during early boot, the first call to OS RNG will block until systems RNG is initialized. It's also possible, though highly unlikely, for OS RNG to fail on some platforms, most likely due to misconfiguration. I'm thinking if it's fine to create one of these for each like for each iteration of the request, or if you want to like make one and store it in the state, which like there is some stuff going on. Fill bytes, what does that do? Is that like the seed or something? Fill the destination with random data. Ah, all right, that's just to generate some random data using whatever type this is and store the result in this slice. So we don't actually have to do that. That was just an example of how to use it. Didn't compile though. Oh, we had the wrong import. I mean, I guess it can't hurt to. It is clone. It's even copy. No, let's just make one each time. And since it uses like this sort of global operating system randomness kind of source, it probably wouldn't matter to store it in the state anyway. It probably still would block the first time. Like that. I don't remember how far we get. Let's just run the test and see what it says. So we do actually get a very random looking token out, which is great. And it responds with not found because of the get me endpoint from earlier. Sweet. So let's close out some of these tabs. So we need to implement /me. Let's put that down below actually. Don't need this anymore. We really should clean out all these imports at some point. something like this, right? Get @/me request with state, get the pool, select star from users where no. We need to get the header, right? Let's comment this out for now. So how do you get the header out of the request? What type is this? It's a tied request. The reason that I'm wondering is because we have multiple request types. We have some from HTTP types, maybe from HTTP service. I don't think so. These were crates that we needed to test our tied application. So let's just say that is tied request to this guy. Header, get a header name. Seems exactly like this. Bring this back. That is authentication. Can we use question mark here? Yes. Header value. Let's just print it out for now to make sure that we're actually getting through. No, we are not. We still get not found. How come? How does it work when you make like multiple routes like this? Server @ so @ returns a route. Say .get that as an endpoint. So I think what we're basically doing is by saying @ up here and then saying @ again down here later, we're basically adding like /users/me, like that, right? So what I think we need to do is end. So this is ends this block up here. And then we say server.at again. There we go, it worked. So it's no longer 404. We are actually .data is missing. And the header value is none, which is curious. Authentication. Did we misspell it? No, it's still none. Curious. You were able to get like an iterator of all the headers. I'm so curious, like, why does it return a vec of header values? I suppose if a single header is defined multiple times in the request, then it returns all of them. I've never seen that before in a web framework. It's curious. Into iterator of what? Huh. So you can convert a request into an iterator of headers. I mean, that's exactly what we want, but I'm just confused that that's the request itself. All right. I suppose that means you can say for header in request like that. Yep. And this should be a tuple. Let's just log it directly. Header. It's probably that we're not setting the header correctly in the test file. Yeah. Should be able to say into iter collect. So the issue that we had before was that if there weren't any headers in our request, then the for loop would basically never run, right? Which is why we didn't see anything in the output here. So now instead we can just collect everything into a vector and then print that out, and then we'll see, we should just see an empty vector. I'm just making sure. Yeah, no headers. Very nice. Then it's probably in our test helpers that we're not setting the header correctly. What does append header return? It returns a result. Unlike insert, this function will not override the contents of a header, but insert a header if there aren't any, or else append to the existing list of headers. So if we call insert as instead, whoops, unlike insert, and this is the other type of request, that's this one. So append header is what we're calling now. There's also insert header. You think those two are the same. Still no headers. Is there a way to like get an iterator of all the headers? Get an HTTP header, get a mutable reference to a header, remove header, iter of what? Yeah, headers. So funny that they went with this design. I guess like what else would a request be an iterator over? It just seems to make more sense that this method was called like headers or something like that. But it works. Request iter collect. Like that. We're not adding any headers. What the fuck? Is that because our test request doesn't actually have any headers? Yeah, it doesn't actually have any headers. Great. There's no headers there. Getting closer. So we add the header here. That does get inserted. What the hell? So that's line 140 and 142. Wait a second, where did it fail? 37. It doesn't actually get there. I was thinking if it like failed earlier up, but it doesn't. What if we say, make this the request? I would like some breakpoints. So we send the request and we call send. That puts us in here. Ah, fuck. Chat, do you see it? We're stupid. We only add headers for post requests. This is a get request. There's a guy earlier who asked if you need to be smart to be an engineer. Clearly not. So we just actually want to add the headers out here. So we do it for all requests. That means it needs to be immutable. So now it should work. Yep. Sweet. So the header is actually there. So this comes from the actual request. So we are seeing the header now. That's great. It's lowercase though, which I guess makes sense to do. Let's just see if we can actually get it as an uppercase with an uppercase name. They showed that in the docs, so it should be possible. Yeah. So that gives us a list of header values. Still is funky that it's a list. It almost seems like a bug. Is there any use case for a request that supplies the same header more than once? Chat, do you know? I'm not sure. So we get the header values. That's a option. So if there's no header, let's unwrap for now. With the to-do of returning an actual error at some point. And let's also say, so this is header values. Get the first one, unwrap. So this is header value. Yep, header HTTP types header value. That one from ASCII Assert. Does it implement deserialize. Wait, no, that's not what we want anyway. We just want the string and then we want to parse it ourselves. Stir. So this is now a, whoops, a string slice like that. And then we can basically, we could do something like header. We could parse it with a regex, but you could also supposedly say split on bearer space and like take the first one. No, take the second one. Nth one, I believe. Returns the nth element of the iterator. Starts from 0. We will probably unwrap on a none. Oops. Let's make these expects. Header not found. No header values. It fails on no header values. Now it's not there. Wasn't it there just before? Am I crazy? No, it is there. So it is it's a sum, so we unwrap that. And there it is. What did we do before that didn't work? Because we said get 1 and we had to say get 0, right? There it is. Unwrap as stir, parsing like before. I think instead of saying nth, it would be cleaner to say skip 1, collect. Yes. So you can imagine if you have like this. Split will basically split on bearer and everything else. So we'll get an iterator where the first element is this one and the rest is everything after that. I mean, it doesn't really matter if we say skip or if we say nth because we only expect that to be one element of the iterator anyway. We really should refactor this to be a regex that's something like beginning of string, bearer, and then like whatever many times and then end of string. We probably should do that. But for now, we're just sort of focusing on getting the test to pass. So we're actually pulling the value out, which is sweet. So this is now the auth token, which we can then use to query the user. So we can say select star from users, inner join auth tokens on auth tokens user ID is user.id, and auth tokens.token is $1 with auth token. Have a syntax error. Users. Because user is a keyword in Postgres, right? Field updated at is specified more than once because we have to say users.star, because otherwise it would select both updated at from auth tokens and user. Expects a vec. Why? I suppose that's this guy. Huh? Vec string. Because we're collecting into a vec, right? We don't want to collect into a vec. We want to collect into a vec and then join it by spaces. So it should be a string. And that works now. Great. Let's say query as user. That basically means that it'll take all the columns that you're selecting from your query and assign those to the corresponding fields of whatever struct type you're providing here. So in this case, we're providing the user type. That means we need to select ID and username. ID, users, username. There we go. Users is not, and that should only be 1. Fetch 1. User. Data. Username. Look at that, it actually compiles. We don't really need this guy anymore. Let's just clean that up. All right, the test actually passes. That's awesome. So we're now able to create users. We're not actually hashing the passwords, I believe. We should probably do that. We also need login. So currently we're able to create a user and then call me. Then we basically want to as well log in with the same user and get back the same token. Let's say the test is creating a user and logging in. Right. I do think we're going to take just a 5-minute break while I get some water. But we'll be back in like 3-5 minutes. All right, we're back. Any questions from chat about what we've been doing so far? Maybe a quick. Let's just make a quick little to-do list with the kind of things that we definitely want to improve. I just noticed now this guy we can pull out like that. Say to-do dot text. We want to test this. We want to actually encrypt passwords, logging in with a token. And then when that's done, I'm thinking we can look at how to actually, proper parsing of the bearer token. Proper parsing of auth header value. We should probably also look into how we can separate this server method into smaller methods, basically pull out the separate endpoints. I think that is it for now. What do you think, chat? Is there anything that we're forgetting? Let's start with the password encryption. That is here. Say we have let hashed password. Like that. And then the crate that we wanted to use was, what was it called? It was this guy. I do think we installed it. Yep. This is basically how you use it. We probably want the hasher in the state. Oops. Hasher, is it cloned? It is not. Creates a new hasher with a sensible default configuration for the average machine. Alright, funny that they provide. It's probably the person's machine that he used when building this library. The hash user passwords for storage database will to adjust these settings for your machine. Alright, I guess we'd have to play around with the exact settings to get somewhere around 300 to 500 milliseconds for hashing the password. I guess we do want to store this hasher in the state. Let's just import it. What does the, I'm just wondering if the hashing actually takes, yeah, that takes a mutable reference to self. Yes, shoot, if you have a question. You can just ask whenever. I'm just thinking if, so hash requires mutable access to self. So if we wanted to store it in state, then we'd have to wrap it in a mutex, which will hurt our concurrency. Not a huge deal. I want to start game development and programming, and I want to buy a PC that is a, for that it's good to buy a pre-built PC. I have no idea. Are you asking like what a good PC would be for game development and programming? I think like just a mid-tier PC is fine. You don't need to go like all out. developing games is at least to my knowledge not as like intense on the computer as actually playing the game is. All right, so since this requires mutable access, let's use a mutex. Arc mutex hasher. It has a lifetime. What's that A? Option password. Are you using COC with Rust Analyzer? No, I'm using Vim LSP, I believe it's called. Yeah, Vim LSP. I've tried COC in the past for Scala development, but I had some smaller issues with it. I also get a bit nervous that you have to have Node installed to run it. It scares me a bit. What sense of passing mute refs in a hasher? Yeah, so if you look at the hash method, you see that it requires mutable access to self. And if we wanted to have one hasher that was shared across requests, we'd have to put it inside the state. But when you get the state out from a request, you can see it just returns an immutable state. And that means that you cannot get a mutable hasher from an immutable state. You can do that, however, if you have it wrapped in a mutex, because the mutex can verify that there's actually only one mutable reference alive at any point. So a mutex is sort of a way to get mutable handles to things that normally aren't mutable, if that makes sense. But I'm not sure that we can do it anyway, because it has, if you look at how it's supposed to be used, like you provided the password there with password dot with password into password A, because it has a lifetime on it, right? Because when you say like dot with password, it stores the password inside it, the secret key as well. So I'm not sure if we can put an A there, because like then we'd have to put it here as well. I think we just want to make one for each request and not actually shared. If that behavior suits you, will you search for another or try to write for a maintainer? So what I really should do is actually read the docs very carefully and figure out, is it actually safe to create one every time? And there seems to be extensive documentation about it. There's nothing specifically that jumps out at me telling you that you should not do that. There's some stuff about configuration and all that stuff, which if we were to create multiple of them, we would make sure that the configuration was the same every time, I think. The issue would be if like calling new was actually slow. But I don't see specifically that it says here that it doesn't. But you're right, we could write the library maintainer if we wanted to. For now, let's just do this, see if it works. Like that. So the password is this one. Why can it fail? Fail with an error. struct representing an error which implements fail. Error kind. All right. So I guess these are like internal error, basically. If we configured the thing incorrectly, then it won't work. Because like salt too long, additional data too long, doesn't sound like user errors, right? Password too long, password too short. Is that because you can configure the hasher to have like a specific password size? Password clearing. Fast but insecure. Opt out of secret key. All right, let's just question mark this guy. Oh my God. Does this not implement standard error? No, it implements fail, which is most likely the failure crate that's been deprecated. And it does not implement standard error. Very nice. Compat. Wraps this failure in a compatibility wrapper. So on anything that implements fail, we can call that compat. Does that mean that we're able to say map error? Probably can't do that because we don't depend on failure ourselves. Use failure. And we need to add the crate, which is unfortunate because the crate is actually deprecated, I believe. If you look, does it say that it's deprecated? I think I saw on Reddit that it was deprecated. Yeah. So I suppose if you wanted to contribute a small thing to open source, you could submit a PR that converts this error type to use anyhow, if you wanted to. That would be convenient. All right, sweet, so that does work. We're now able to use question mark. And the reason that we couldn't use question mark before is you can only, endpoints like this can only return errors that implement the standard error trait. We should probably make a secret key. It doesn't matter exactly what it is in development. If you were to deploy this to production, you should take great care to make this, to keep it safe. And for var, what does that return? It returns a result string var. I think that's it. The test should probably still pass, right? Yep. It's pretty slow though. And if you notice, there's a huge spike in CPU. I didn't show there. But I think it ran red just before, which is probably because it takes a while to do the default hashing. Now, what I would like to try is not actually call hash, but instead call hash non-blocking. Like this. so we can actually use async. So that returns a future, we await that, then we map the error. The issue is, and we talked about this like way back in the beginning of the stream, let's close a bunch of these tabs, that this returns a, you unfortunately can't see the version of the future in these docs. Let's just go to docs.rs. Hash non-blocking future. So you can see it's a 0.1 future. What we need is a 0.3 future. So there's a huge, basically a breaking change into the whole future ecosystem from future 0.1 and future 0.3, which is where the future trait moved into the standard library. However, the future crate provides, has a module called compat, similar to what we saw before with the fail trait. And I believe if we say this one converts a 0.1 future stream, whatever, into a compatible 3.0 future. So we should be able to wrap our future in this guy and then call await on that. And just import it. Why can we not import it? Do not depend on futures. What? Futures 0.1. What? Huh? It appears as if we don't actually get the correct version of the futures crate, right? It appears that when we import this one that we get the 0.1 version and not the 0.3 version that we're specifying here. Because it says that that module doesn't exist. And if you look in the docs, it's true, it's not there, right? And it also mentions that if you want to depend on futures, you can add this to your cargo, which it most likely would not do in 0.3. Yeah, the README is totally different. Why is that? Like, I get that you're able to depend on the same crate multiple times. But like here I specify this is the exact version that I want. That sucks. Nice dot fast, thanks. How do we fix that? I know that you can like rename crates in your cargo.toml. Would that help? Whoops. What do you rename a crate? Rename crate. Package. So that needs to be the rename, and this needs to be the actual name. Still doesn't compile. What? I'm honestly not sure what's going on. So what I think I'm going to do for now, just to sort of move on, let's make a note of it. Figure out why it seems we're getting version. Specified in our cargo.toml. What we can do instead is just use spawn blocking from async standard. So instead of doing this, we just say dot hash, do the blocking version like this, and then we can say use async std task oops. Spawn blocking. This, I believe. Yeah, so now the issue is that it can't convert this one into an instance of fail. I guess. Let's just pull that out. Secret key. And now we move create user. I'm not sure if this is going to work. Nah. Yeah, so the issue is what it was saying before. So it's complaining that we, let's see. So we make the create user struct, and then we move it into our blocking task, basically this closure here, and we move it because we say create user.password. If we do like this, does that work? I don't think move is just going to give us the same problem that we had before. Yeah. So the issue is that we're moving the create user type into this closure, and then we're using it afterwards down here, which we obviously can't do because like we don't know when this thread is finished. So I think what we have to do is say basically copy the password out of the user. So clear text password, clone, and then use that instead in here, like that. So now we're not actually moving the create user, we're just cloning the password and moving that. And what spawn blocking does is it basically takes some computation that blocks and basically takes a long time to finish, potentially a long time, and puts that on a special thread pool specifically for blocking tasks. Because if you block inside of an async future context, it's gonna mess up your whole executor because it's not designed to handle that. So Tokyo and async standard as well, which is what we're using, has this special mechanism for like basically a place where you can put blocking tasks and sort of turn them into futures, if you will. And it has a thread pool designated just for those kinds of tasks. So now we are successfully hashing the password, I believe. Our test should still pass. It does. You saw it was a bit slow there. That's fine. So the passwords are being encrypted. Let's do login next. So many tabs. So we actually want to be able to log in. Let's say, what's the endpoint to log in? I've seen previously in REST that you could be like, call it. In REST, you can think of it as you're creating a session. So it'd be something like post/sessions. I kind of like that. Let's just go with that. So this is that sort of a session is a resource, and you can create one of those, and creating one of those results in getting a token back. So let's say response is post /session with a no, it doesn't make sense because I want the username in there as well. Something like this, right? Does that make sense? This needs to be post. What do you think, chat? What should our URL be to log in? I guess this would work. You can spend a long time arguing about what is RESTful and what is not. I'm not sure there's a lot of value to doing that. How do you pull like paths out of a URL in Tide? I haven't done that before. Tide. Route. I don't have an example of how to do that. Nope. What can you get out of a request? Param. extract and parse a route parameter by name. Returns the results of parsing parameter according to the inferred output type T. The name should not include. Alright, so I suppose that means that if you define the route like this, then you can say when you have the request, you can say like dot param as a string. The key is username, something like that. I'm pretty sure that's what they want us to do. It would just be nice if they actually had an example in their docs, which it does not seem like they do. Route. I feel like in general the docs are slightly lacking. All right, let's just try it and let's see what happens. So if we call this endpoint /session, is that nicer? Yeah, let's do that. So that returns a what does that return? That returns something like this, right? Just add the assertion that that is actually what we get back. The JSON is the response from the server. I think that's correct. So if we log in again with the same password, then we should get back the same token. So then tests that we could add around here is logging in with the wrong password, logging in with the username doesn't exist, those kinds of things. I usually like to implement sort of the happy path first to get that working and then think about the edge cases from that point. All right, so /username session. This should fail with a 404 saying that the route doesn't exist. And it does. No, that's a panic. Test mod 45. Yeah, because the response is a 404 and not a 200. Yeah. The response was not found, but we expected a 200, 201 created. All right, that's one more of these. Server at users username session post. Then we want to parse it into one of these. I always called it Sunday testing or sunny day testing. I've never heard that term before. I've heard happy path and sad path. But I like yours more. I'm going to call it that. What's the opposite of sunny day? Is it rainy day? How do we pull out the param? Param. Not sure. Maybe you only tested the sunny days and not the rainy days. That gives us a username. We also want the password from the body JSON. We're gonna like clean up all these like sort of input and output types towards when we sort of get a bit further with a few more endpoints. Currently it's just a bit messy that we just have one called user and like password. That's like what is that for? The question mark already can only be applied to tries. You usually stream Rust? Yes. I've streamed a bit of Ruby like a long time ago, but for now I'm trying to focus on Rust. So this is, we eventually want a token at the end. Why does body JSON return? Self. What type is that? Impl future. Ah, right, because body JSON is async. There we go. So this should be a, and we can say dot password. And then we need to find the user with this username, find that user's password, verify the password, find the corresponding auth token. So we need to find the user. User password, because we technically only care about the password, right? Select hashed password from user, where username is username. Fetch option, I believe there is. We need the database pool. Which we get like this. Hashed password does not exist. What did we call it? Ah, because this is called users. So at the company where I work, we name all the tables in singular. What I'm used to is plural, so that's why we're doing plural today. But I'm still in the habit of typing user. The reason that that's a bit annoying is because user is actually a keyword in Postgres, so you cannot have a table called user. You have to, well, you can, but you have to escape it like with quotes around it every time you query for it. But I'm used to plurals anyway, so that's fine. No fetch option. Is it fetch optional? Yep. So this will return, I believe, like an option thing that has a hashed password. Yeah. So it returns an optional whatever thing that the macro generated for us. So we should be able to say let user password is user password unwrap dot hashed password. Of course, we don't actually want to unwrap here. We want to return a 404. Let's add that to our to-do. Logging in with a username that doesn't exist should return 404, not panic. I'm a huge fan of like having a text file or a note file or something while you're developing. So whenever you encounter something and you're like, oh, I should fix this later at some point, write it down and then get back to it later. Otherwise, you're going to get distracted and like move around constantly. I like to sort of focus on getting one thing working and then writing miscellaneous stuff that I noticed along the way down to stay focused. So that's the password. Then we need to verify that. We need to hash. We need to verify this one that came from the database against the one that we got in. Let's call this, let's just call it password. So the sort of hashing password library thing that we were using has specifically an API to verify passwords, which we're going to use next. It looks like this apparently. And we have to import the verifier. So the hash is user password. The password is password. The secret is the one that we were using just before. Where was that? This guy. Secret key. And we want to, just like before, we want to wrap this in a spawn blocking, I believe. Does it have like a verify non-blocking? Yeah, it does. So let is valid, task spawn blocking, await. We probably have to do the same error compatibility conversion dance that we had to do before. Like this. Yep, it does actually work. Is valid should be a Boolean. And it is, that's great. If is valid. Then you get the token, otherwise, who knows? Now we actually need to find the token. Select token from auth tokens, where user ID. Do we have the user ID? No. Let's say this is user. What type is this? So that's an optional. because we use fetch optional. We still need to actually handle this result. That was the to-do that we wrote down before. Username dot ID. Actually, that actually does compile, so I suppose it works. Token row fetch 1. All right. Can we get in here and not have a token? I suppose so. Should we then, is that allowed? No. Currently the endpoint to create a user and to log in are the same. Basically, they take the username and the password. Well, no, the one to log in takes the username and the URL, so I guess semantically they are different. And it's just sort of accidental that they both happen to only take the username and the password. I suppose in the future the endpoint to actually create a user might take more data. Yeah, I was just wondering if it would make sense to, like, if you log in with a user, no, like that doesn't even make any sense because we find the user earlier. I was wondering if we would like create the request or create the token even if it wasn't there, but that doesn't make any sense. Because up here we do actually assume that the user exists and we try to find the password. So I just noticed that it was complaining that calling .body.json requires a mutable reference to the request. You just look in the docs. Right there, a mutable reference. I suppose that's because you can imagine the sort of body for a request to basically be a stream, and a stream is sort of like an async iterator, and in order to call next on an iterator you have to have a mutable reference to the iterator, so the iterator can like mutate its internal state and stuff. And so an async iterator or a stream is sort of the same, which means that in order to read from that stream that is the request body, you need a mutable reference to self. So we just need to declare this mutable up here. And now stuff is actually type checking. Let's see if it works. And it does, hooray. Just to be sure, if we return garbage data, does the test actually then fail? Because we never technically saw the test fail with like got back the wrong token. And it does. So it is successfully comparing the token. We don't have like a stupid mistake in our test that makes not actually test anything. To a 1. All right. Let's try to clean this up a bit because we're basically done with authentication now, right? Unless there's anything we're missing. I don't think so. We can create users, we can make authenticated endpoints, and we can log in afterwards with a password and get back the same token. I think we're good. Let's look at our to-do list. Logging in with a token, we just did that. Proper parsing of header auth value. This one is curious. I'm not sure what's going on there. Map invalid data error to some 400 response. Yeah. So that is up here when we try to parse the body using Serde and some deserializable thing. If that doesn't work, currently it returns a 500, which in this case is actually a user error and not an internal server error. So that is something that we have to address at some point. Logging in with username that doesn't exist to return 400, not panic. Yeah, so that's a new test that we would write where we actually try to log in with like some user that doesn't exist, and that should give a 400 and not a panic. But for now, let's see if we can, should we fix these to-dos? I think it makes sense to fix all the like unwraps and the to-dos first, and then probably refactor afterwards. Yeah, let's do that. So the first one is if the user doesn't exist. There needs to be an async test. Logging in with unknown user gives 404. So the test is going to be similar to this one. We're going to make the server, and then we're just going to try to log in. And the response from that should be 404. Bob is fine. I mean, Bob doesn't exist at this point. We haven't created any users. So now I expect it to fail that it got some like 500 or a panic or something. Which it does on 171 in main, which is this one exactly. So let's say, let's match. If it's a none, we just want to return 404. Can you do this? Yep. Not found. Sweet. That was this one. What was the other one? That is if the token is invalid. Let's do that as well. Logging in with invalid token. So we actually have to create a user. That was that request, right? Yep. And then with an invalid token, Baz gives a what? I don't know all the HTTP status codes. And I'm not quite sure what the semantic meanings of them are. It's definitely a client error, right? Unauthorized. Similar to 403 forbidden, but specifically when the authentication is required and has failed or has not yet been provided. The request contained valid data and was understood by the server, but the server's refused action. I guess that makes sense. Because like you are sending a valid sort of login request, but you're not able to obtain the token resource. Yeah, let's do 403 forbidden. So I expect it to panic on this to do here. And it does. It's annoying that the tests are so slow. I wonder if we can configure the hasher in the test environment to be slower. Or rather, no, to be faster, do less iterations. Let's write that down. Configure hasher in tests to be faster. So if the token is invalid, then we want to return okay, forbidden. $4.18, is that teapot? Yeah. That is so weird that like that is in there in the spec, which means that like every library that has to implement status codes has to deal with that. I suppose it is here. Documentation. Yeah, there it is. I'm a teapot. Great. The server refuses the attempt to brew coffee with a teapot. Nice. And they probably have tests for this thing and all sorts of stuff. Not sure what's going on. Did the test pass? Sure did. All right. I think we should probably commit this. User authentication. All right. So let's try to think. How would we? Let's see if we can fix this one first and make the password hashing thing faster. Hasha. Can you customize the number of iterations? Here are the default configurations. Iterations 192. Configure iterations. Do you have to do the same thing on the verifier? Nope. Makes sense. Is it faster now? Yeah, that was significantly faster. We should only do this in tests though. So we need to know if we're in the test environment or if we're in the production environment, basically. All right, that's not too bad. Let's do that. Let's make a module called env. Source env.rs. And add a test. In test env during tests. So I figure we're gonna have some function called like current that you'd call like create env like this. Are you writing this app without a framework? Well, I mean, sort of. The framework that we're using is called Tide, and it's a fairly sort of lightweight framework. It's not a framework in the sense that like Django or Ruby on Rails are frameworks. So I don't know that it provides sort of a built-in environment kind of thing for you. No. But I mean, we can handle it fairly easily with an environment variable. Something like this. So we would have an env type that can be either production. Let's call it development. So development will be when it's running locally on our machine, not in test mode. We could also add a staging environment if we need that at some point. And test. And then we need a function called current. This needs to be pub. Returns an env. And it just does cd env var. Let's call it app env. If it is production, because we have a borrow. I never know what the magic methods is to pattern match in strings. It seems like Assert works. And it cannot be compared for quality. That's because we need to derive EQ, partial EQ. Let's also just do copy and clone. If I can type. Copy and clone are easy to implement, are basically very cheap to implement for these types because env doesn't really have any data. At runtime, env will basically just be, I don't know, a very small amount of data just telling you exactly which variant you have, since each one doesn't have like any data associated with it. I don't know if that's like 2 bits or something. I'm not sure. Does it pass? It probably doesn't because we haven't set the environment variable, which makes sense. So it should be app-env should be development, and then we want to override it during tests. So std env set var app-env does that return a result? Nope. Should pass now. There we go. We should probably call this here, where we do sort of the rest of the test setup. Where do we do that? In test DB. It's a bit weird that we do that in the test databases where we set up environment variables. I think we should remove that. So the reason that we need to sort of override this environment variable is because we don't have a specific .env file for tests. I think we should move this out. Where would it make sense to put it? We had that setup function that was called test setup. I think it makes more sense to do there. And then instead of doing this, we can just say test setup. And the test helpers module is private. That returns a future. That's fine. Very nice. So now, here, we can say, so we say use create env. Env is defined multiple times. All right, because we don't need to import it because we define the module in this file. So if env current is env test, then we do that, otherwise not. You could technically also have a .isTest method, kind of like that. Let's add that. Assert env.isTest. Method not found. Like that. We could technically write this as an if-let. I personally prefer the match. It doesn't really matter. Great. Tests were significantly faster. That's nice. Can we just say 1? Very nice. That was that one. I still don't know about this one. I think I'm gonna have to do some Googling around to figure out exactly what's going on. Proper parsing of auth header value. Let's do that. I think that might be the last thing we do for the stream today. So that was where we wanted to bring in, actually parse this with a regex. Do we have the regex crate? We don't. Bring in. We're gonna want lazy static as well. Recompile the docs. I believe the root has a pretty good example. Yeah, so we're gonna want to do something like this. Basically, when you call regex.new, it will actually do stuff. It'll sort of compile that string that you gave it into some like graph representation of what a regex actually is. And doing that is not cheap, or rather not free. So you don't want to do that when you're reusing the same regex every time. You actually want to cache it in sort of a global that you can reuse. And an easy way to do that is to use lazy static. So let's put that in there. We're gonna have to import some stuff. Lazy static. All right, what was the pattern that we wanted? Bara. Beginning, bunch of stuff, end, anything 0 or more times. I think that should work. The header value is already the string. We should also handle these errors in here. Let's make a to-do for that. How do you get the matches? Captures iter. I believe there is like a captures thing that you can call captures. Yep. So we say header pattern dot captures on the header value, unwrap in case there's no match, and then you can say get the first one. And the reason that this is one index is that sort of tradition, I believe, with regex is that the 0th thing in like a list of regex captures is always the whole sort of capture itself, or the whole like everything that was matched. So if the regex matched the whole string, then it'll be the whole string. In this case, the regex matched this bit and took out the name and the year. So that's why the 0th one returns that match. That's common in regex libraries, I believe. So we get the first one, and that is auth token. And captures returns a captures that you can index into like this. That works. See the test will pass. They do. Nice. I'm usually not a fan of having these just sort of like randomly inside methods. I usually prefer to pull them out. It doesn't matter from like a code point of view, but from a readability point of view, I think it does make sense. What do we call this? Var token regex. Like that. It's much cleaner. We still need to get rid of these unwraps. I think that's just returning like unauthorized or something. So this returns an option. Get returns an option. I don't think that's actually too bad to do. Let's do that. So what does this return? Let's pull this out. Auth header key. You'll see why later, why we need to pull it out. Like that. So the cool thing is that here we're doing an unwrap on an option, and down here we're doing an unwrap on an option as well. So we're basically sort of unwrapping two options if you want. So what I'm hoping that we can actually do is use question mark. I think most people who come to Rust or who write Rust are familiar with the question mark operator specifically for option or for results. But what you might not know is you can actually use it on options as well. So if we have a function like foo that returns an option something, if you have like a bar, maybe it's called like option sum. It takes an A, that's an option I32, and it takes a B, that's an option I32, and then returns an optional sum. You can say let A equal a question mark. And that will basically do the question marks or result unwrapping thing. So if A is an option or is a none, then it'll return none from the whole function. And then we can do the same for B. So it's basically exactly like it works for results. And then we can say sum A plus B. So what I'm thinking is that we can use something similar here using this question mark thing. You could probably use some like fancy iterator methods to like zip them or chain them or something. But question mark is cool. What I'm thinking is if we make a closure and immediately invoke it, then we can do this. And then we can replace this one with a question mark. And this one with a question mark. And it works, sweet. And then we do obviously need to pattern match on header value, right? If it's not there, we want to return not an OK, but we just need to bind this. Non-authoritative information. What does that mean? I've used. Oh my god. Bad request, I suppose. And we could imagine pulling this into like a get header value helper function kind of thing. For now, let's just leave it here. Let's run the test and see if everything still works. Very nice. I think that was mainly refactorings, right, that we did? Yeah. Properly handle errors in /me. That were these errors, right? There's no unwraps left in here. Nope. Unwrap. These unwraps are fine because that's just when starting up the server. Can't handle those. Expect regex didn't match. That one should be easy enough. It's very similar to this one. Bad request. To still pass. Very nice. No more expecs left, and the unwraps that are left, we basically we can't really deal with. I think that's it for today. We basically managed to, so if you look at the test, we basically managed to get authentication and authorization complete with password and encrypting passwords and logging in and a bit of error handling. So I think all in all, this was quite a productive stream. I think what we're going to look into next time is first we're going to start to try to split this up. Like our server function is getting quite huge, and there's definitely some patterns that we can see that we're sort of repeating ourselves. So for example, like matching on an option and then returning some like error response if it's a none. That's probably something that we want to pull out. Otherwise, that's 4 lines that you have to repeat all the time, right? This stuff to get a header value out, we're not really reusing that in multiple places currently, but I think for the sake of readability, it would be nice to pull it out into a separate function. Currently having to read like 9 lines just to get a header value is a bit excessive. I would also like to make actual data structures for these response types. Currently, they're just sort of like willy-nilly in there. There's technically nothing that enforces the data word here. So if we wanted to call it something else, or we made a typo accidentally, the compiler would not catch that. Yeah, so I think those are some of the things we're going to look into during the next stream. And then we're going to get to like actual sort of Twitter-ish stuff where you can post tweets and you can follow each other and you can get your timeline, maybe with some direct messages, stuff like that. But yeah, so thank you for joining. I hope it was fun. I hope you learned a thing or two. I certainly did. Yeah, thank you for watching. Now let's see, is there anybody who's online streaming Rust programming on Twitch right now? Because if so, then we definitely want to rate them. If you have anyone that you want us to rate, feel free to put in the chat. Is there anyone who's streaming Rust? Game engine programming. What do you think, chat? Who should we rate? There's no one online streaming Rust. That's unfortunate. Oh, random projects in Rust. 9 viewers. Museum. Let's rate this guy. Yeah, so thanks you all for watching, and I'll catch you next week. See ya.